Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, the Senate Armed Services Committee, led by Democrats, decided to take Republicans up on their suggestion to increase the military budget by $25 billion over what Joe Biden was even asking for. They claimed Joe Biden's military budget, which was an increase of over $10 billion from last year, simply wasn't high enough to keep up with alarming inflation, not to mention China. So they are allotting an additional $25 billion of taxpayer money to the Pentagon. But that's not all. The Democrats also decided to include an amendment that would potentially double the number of troops in a wartime draft. If they get their way, not only will men 18 to 25 be compelled to serve, but women will be as well. Committee Chair, Democrat Jack Reed from Rhode Island, proposed the amendment that was first championed by the late John McCain in 2016. Now, this is all being done in the name of equality. Ever since women have been allowed to serve in combat roles, the discussion of women also having to register with the selective service system has come into question. Some say if men have to do it, women should as well. However, the early motivations for the discussion have not always been about equality. Conservatives who believe in traditional gender roles use the discussion as a way to threaten society into changing their support for women in combat. It hasn't worked. Women warriors still fight in battle, and more conservatives have come to terms with it. Now, conservative war hawks see an opportunity to drastically increase military numbers in the event we end up in a war with China, a country that has over 4 times our population. Now, Democrats, who are just as hawkish as Republicans, see the same opportunity, but they frame it entirely under the guise of wokeness. We're an equal society, and we women are just as competent. Though I agree with that, I don't think equality is forcing women to die in foreign wars just like the men. If Democrats truly want an enlightened society, they should be working to abolish the selective service for both men and women. The idea that young Americans belong to the government and can be called upon at the government's will to sacrifice their lives in battle is archaic and barbaric, especially when people are losing faith and confidence in our leaders' ability to make good policy decisions. Do you really trust Nancy Pelosi, Lindsey Graham, Liz Cheney, or Tim Kaine with you or your kid's life? Do you trust that our government will only lead us into necessary wars that protect our borders and our national sovereignty? That they won't do anything that isn't politically or financially motivated, but only what's best in the interest of our country? I don't. Wealthy elites throughout history have sacrificed peasants to achieve expansion, money, and power, and it's hard to trust our elites today are any different. And even if we could trust them, forcing people to give up their lives for wars they don't believe in is the antithesis of freedom. If the cause is worthy, Americans will sign up. The armed services saw record enlistees after 9/11, and I have no doubt that if the country were truly under threat, Americans would sign up to defend our nation again. But wars like Vietnam were really only about stopping the USSR's influence and not wars we should have ever enacted a draft for. Yet we did. Thousands of lives were lost. Families were torn apart. A beautiful country blown to bits. And for what? Now, with China's rising influence on everyone's brain, this new revived discussion of a draft and attempts to expand it to women have me worried. Is this an attempt to build up our reserves in the event our government decides we must step in to defend Taiwan, Hong Kong, or the Uyghurs, for example? A war with China would be a disaster, but each day with the increasingly hostile rhetoric against the nation coming from both sides of the aisle, the odds of war get closer. And the odds the government would want to enact the draft do as well, especially if they're talking about expanding it. Now, Robbie, I do want to point out that Elizabeth Warren was the only Democrat who did vote against this. There were a couple of Republicans who voted against this as well. And there are some efforts by some conservatives and Democrats alike, coalitions that are working together, led by Rand Paul, who are trying to abolish the selective service system. And there are some arguments for why we should have a conscripted service. Some people believe that the volunteer military is actually the reason why we have these forever wars. They think that when not everyone in society is invested, giving up their own life or even their children's lives, that people kind of turn a blind eye to what's happening. And that's why we've ended up in these wars that have lasted decades. So I can kind of see, the idea that if everyone were invested, then maybe that would limit it, but it doesn't seem to have worked for like Israel, for example. And then the other good argument for keeping or even moving towards a more robust conscripted service is that, maybe if everybody had to serve the country in some way, that it would bring people out of their sort of isolated bubbles, and they would have to work with others, and maybe we would be a more united country. I don't know. I mean, do you think there's any good to any of this?
Frankly, no. I'm always skeptical of arguments that go along the lines of, okay, if we made everything really bad, like a lot worse, and we violated people's rights even more manifestly, somehow this would be good. Or sometimes people try to argue that tactically. Well, what if if you were sending everyone to Afghanistan, then the government, there'd be some pressure not to do it. And I'm very skeptical, and also that would just be horrible. I think selective service to draft, I think it's immoral. I think it's unconstitutional. To my mind, the plain meaning of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, certainly to my mind covers this case of sending people against their will to die on foreign battlefields. It's funny that I'm seeing a lot of like pro-civil liberties people, or kind of what you alluded to, wokeness people, saying that this is a win for equality because we're going to draft women too, which is just nuts to me. We should not violate more people's rights. That doesn't achieve that. If the Chinese Exclusion Act also excluded like Japanese people and African people and Mexican people, it wouldn't have been better because it was like a more inclusive evil. Unfortunately, that's the kind of brand of progressivism that is I think popular among a certain kind of mainstream Democrat. That's like the future is feminine. Let's call the bomb the mother of all bombs, but we're still going to drop it on someone.
Well, and that's the thing. I think that that's the words that they use in order to get the populace to go along with this. But I think ultimately it comes down to just all of the war hawks in Congress, which are on both sides of the aisle. It doesn't make a difference. Democrats, Republicans, they're all the same. I mean, we see this now with them going along with, here we are, a full Democrat White House, Senate, and House, and yet they're raising the military budget not only over and beyond above the 10 billion, but another 25 billion. So we're seeing that war hawks are on both sides of the aisle, and I just think that they use the sweet language that they know they need to use. Republicans do it and Democrats do it in order to get the population to just go along with it. They know what's going to work. And that's what they've done this time, is say, it's because of equality. But it's all, yay, we get to all go into servitude together, forced servitude together, and give up our lives together, I guess.
And the people in power lie about this stuff routinely. They promise. I mean, this is a massive problem. They promise that they're going to end militarism. They're going to end foreign involvement. I personally believe Barack Obama won for that reason, because he promised a break from the Bush years, and then he didn't deliver that at all. He considered new interventions in places like Libya. He wanted to do it in Syria. And then Trump also promised a clear break from that consensus. And, I think he still often used that rhetoric while hiring people like John Bolton to write his foreign policy. So even though these people promise it's going to be different, it's clearly what the people want, and then it never is.
Never is. Here we are, just keep rotating around the world with where we're going to be doing all of these forever endless wars. So
it's a nasty problem that requires serious thought and some kind of solution, because we can't keep doing this. Anyway, thank you so much. Coming up, Colin Ruggiero and Philip Wegman are with us for Team Rising next. Stick with us.